She knocked 3 times. Quietly. The way you knock when you're not entirely sure you should be knocking at all. It was 11:14 on a Thursday in November, which I know because I had been looking at the clock on the microwave the way I'd been doing most nights. Not because I was waiting for anything, just because the clock was something to look at that wasn't the photograph on the shelf or the second mug I kept forgetting to put away. I opened the door, and she was standing in the hallway in a gray coat with her arms crossed over her chest, and she said, "I'm sorry to come this late." I didn't know who else to ask. I had lived 3 feet from this woman for 7 months. Her name was on the buzzer panel next to mine. I had heard her coffee maker through the shared wall every morning at 7:15 with the reliability of something I had stopped noticing because it was consistent. The sound of someone else's routine running parallel to mine. The ordinary evidence of another life in the same building, doing the ordinary thing of beginning a day. I had heard her television on Thursday nights. I had heard, twice in October, what I was fairly certain was someone crying quietly, a contained sound, private. The kind that stays small on purpose, and I had not known then whether it was her or whether the building was doing the thing old buildings do, which is absorb the sounds of everyone who has ever lived in them and release them slowly, at unexpected hours. Like something that can't be kept in indefinitely. I had not spoken to her once. I had seen her perhaps 20 times in 7 months, in the lobby, at the mailboxes, in the elevator, on the stairs, and in each of those 20 encounters, I had managed the minimum required. A nod, a thank you, a good morning returned to its sender. I had never asked her name, though I knew it from the panel. I had never registered her face well enough to find it in memory afterward. I had moved past her each time with the careful, efficient motion of someone who has learned to minimize the surface area of their daily life, because surface area is where things get added on, and I had nothing left for things to be added on to. I need to tell you why, because the why is the whole story. My wife's name was Claire. She died 11 months before that November night, on a Tuesday in December, of a cause that had been diagnosed 7 months before that, and that we had spent those 7 months fighting with the specific, ferocious, organized hope of people who have decided that data and treatment protocols and clinical trials and second opinions are a form of agency, and that agency is the thing you hold on to when the alternative is helplessness. She was 36 years old. She had a laugh that started with her eyes before it reached her mouth, a sequence I watched happen hundreds of times and never stopped finding remarkable. The way amusement arrived in her face before she decided to let it out. She was better at making friends in a new place than anyone I have ever known or am likely to know. She could have a real conversation with a stranger in the time it took to wait for a crosswalk light, not the surface kind, the actual kind, the kind where something true was exchanged, and the stranger would always look slightly surprised afterward, as if they'd been given something they hadn't expected to be given and weren't quite sure what to do with the gratitude. This was not a performance. It was simply how she occupied space. She was interested in people in the complete way, the way that doesn't perform interest but actually has it, and people felt this immediately and gave her things accordingly. I moved into this building 2 months after she died. The apartment we had shared for 4 years was 30 blocks away, and it was full of the specific weight of every object we had chosen together. The table we debated over for 3 weeks. The lamp she'd found at the weekend market and carried home under her arm because it was too fragile to put in a bag. The kitchen herb she'd started in a window box the spring before the diagnosis, which I had kept alive for 7 months after she was gone out of a commitment I couldn't have fully explained, and finally, quietly, couldn't maintain. Every object in that apartment was a choice we had made together, and being in a room with those objects was the same as being in a room with the choosing, and I could not do it anymore. The new apartment was neutral. That was the entire and complete reason I chose it. It had no history that was mine. The walls were the particular inoffensive white of a space that has been prepared for someone rather than lived in with them. The kitchen had never known what she liked to cook. The bathroom tiles were clean in the way of things that have not yet accumulated the ordinary sediment of a life shared in a place. It was, in the most useful and intentional sense, empty. A container that had not yet been filled, that had not been filled and then partially emptied, that did not have the shape of what used to be in it pressed into every surface. I had chosen empty on purpose. I was living inside it on purpose. The radius of my daily life had contracted to the distance between my front door and my office 3 blocks over, and the grocery store 2 blocks beyond that. And I was maintaining this radius with the deliberate intention of someone who has taken accurate stock of their remaining capacity and knows that exceeding the limit will cost more than they currently have. I was not in hiding. I was in triage. The specific triage of someone managing the aftermath of a loss that does not have a fixed timeline and that does not respond well to being rushed. The woman in 4B, Petra, the buzzer panel said, had been existing at the edge of my contracted world for 7 months, and I had let her stay there. She had said good morning once in September at the mailboxes, and I had said it back and kept moving toward the elevator. She had held the front door for me in early October, and I had said thank you and passed through without stopping. She had, I recalled now, once been in the lobby when I came in from the grocery store carrying 3 bags, and she had taken one of them from me without asking. The way you take a bag from someone when the taking is obviously useful, and asking first would slow the whole thing down, and I had said thank you at the elevator, and that had been the longest exchange we had managed in 7 months. She had a face I had not retained the shape of. She had a name I knew from a buzzer panel and had not attached to a person. She had existed at the edge of my contracted world as a shape I had decided not to engage with, not because I disliked her, but because engagement required something I had temporarily stopped having. I was aware that this made me a poor neighbor. I was aware that there had been a version of myself, before December, who would have introduced himself in the first week and known her name and her situation, and probably been helpful to her in some ordinary way by now. That version of myself was not available. I was doing the things I could do and leaving the rest, and the rest included her. And then she was at my actual door at 11:14 on a Thursday, and she said she didn't know who else to ask. I said, "Come in." She looked slightly surprised. I think she had expected more resistance, or perhaps a question. Or perhaps simply that the door would stay mostly closed, in the way a door stays mostly closed, when the person behind it has been managing very carefully for a long time, and the management involves keeping things out as much as anything else. Then she came in and stood in the entry of my neutral apartment, and I looked at her, properly, for what I understood was essentially the first time in 7 months of proximity. She was perhaps 34 or 35. She had dark hair that she'd pulled back quickly, not for the evening, for a late knock, for coming across a hallway at 11 at night. She was wearing the gray coat over what looked like pajamas, which told me the coat had been the fast concession to the idea of presenting herself as someone who had dressed to come out. She had not been able to sleep. The coat was the compromise between that fact and knocking on a neighbor's door. I noticed, with a slightly delayed perception of someone who has not been attending closely to other people's faces for months, that she looked exhausted in a specific and particular way. Not the tiredness of a long day or a stressful week. The other kind. The kind that comes from something that has been going on too long with insufficient resolution, where the effort of managing it has started to accumulate in the face in ways that sleep doesn't fully correct. The building manager told me something, she said, about a report you filed 6 weeks ago. I thought about it. The smell, I said. The smell, she said. Yes, in September I had noticed a faint smell in my bathroom, something damp and organic, not immediately alarming, but persistent. I had mentioned it to the building manager in early October without particular urgency, in the way you mentioned something that seems like it might be worth noting. He had made a note. I had not thought about it again. "I need to ask you something," Petra said. "And I need you to tell me exactly what you told him, because I've been trying to get him to do something about this for 4 months and he keeps telling me there's no corroborating evidence." I looked at her. 4 months, I said. "The ceiling in my bedroom," she said. "There's a water source in the wall between our units, or above mine. The building manager says above mine, but the smell in your report suggests it's between us. I have photographs. I have a letter from a remediation company that says there's active mold in the structure. I have been sleeping on my friend's sofa for 6 weeks because the remediation company said the bedroom wasn't safe to sleep in until it's addressed." She said it in the flat, careful cadence of someone reciting a timeline they have rehearsed for an audience that keeps not acting on it. He won't commission the remediation work because he says one report from a tenant doesn't constitute a habitability emergency. He says he needs corroborating evidence from an adjacent unit. The quiet of the apartment was very loud for a moment. "You've been sleeping on a sofa," I said. "For 6 weeks," she said. "I'm still paying full rent." "Why didn't you?" I stopped. I already knew why. I had made it quite clear, without words, for 7 months that I was not available. I had built the unavailability carefully and maintained it consistently, and she had respected it. The question I'd started to ask was not a fair one. "I didn't know about your report until yesterday," she said. "If I'd known, I would have come sooner." A pause. "Actually, I don't know if I would have. You've seemed like someone who needed the space, and I didn't want to." She stopped. She looked at me for a moment in a way that was direct and also careful, the way you look at someone when you've been paying more attention to them than they know. "I'm sorry. This is a lot to bring to your door at 11 at night." "Sit down," I said. "Tell me what you need from me." She sat at my kitchen table, the table I had not had a second person at in 11 months. The table where I ate alone and worked alone, and sometimes sat without doing anything specific, just occupying the neutral space as the neutral space. And she told me the full shape of it. The leak had started in July, a slow seep that she had initially managed with towels, and a bowl placed with the resigned familiarity of someone who has decided to wait and see before escalating. By August it had gotten into the wall in a way that was visible, a dark bloom spreading upward from the baseboard, slow and definite. By September the smell was significant enough that she had called a remediation company on her own initiative, paid the assessment fee herself, $300, which she had not had to spare, but which felt like the documentation she needed, and received a report that used specific and serious language about active mold in the wall structure and in the subfloor beneath the water source. She had gone to the building manager with the report. He had told her the remediation company was recommending work they had a financial incentive to recommend, and that he would need to verify the findings with his own contractor before authorizing anything. His contractor had not come. She had written a formal letter citing the relevant habitability statutes by section number, which she had looked up herself. He had written back to say he was monitoring the situation. She had written again. He had responded that the situation did not yet rise to the level requiring emergency remediation because the reported issue was confined to a single unit and there was no corroborating evidence from adjacent tenants. Adjacent tenants. 3 feet away. 7 months. She had found the tenant's rights attorney through a community legal clinic 3 weeks ago. The attorney had reviewed the documentation, the photographs, the remediation report, the formal letters, the building manager's responses, and had told her the case was strong, but would be significantly stronger with corroborating evidence from an adjacent unit. Because the landlord's primary defense was that the issue was contained and minor, and that a single tenant's report was not sufficient to compel emergency remediation on a timeline that suited the tenant rather than the landlord. He told her adjacent unit evidence would change his position substantially, Petra said. He's been using the single report defense for 4 months. And then you found out about my report, I said. Yesterday, she said. The building manager mentioned it when I asked him again. He thought he was demonstrating he'd already acted on the issue. He told me there was a report from the unit above mine that he'd noted in October. She said it with the flat, controlled quality of someone who has been managing their anger at this situation for 4 months and has it well in hand. I asked him why he hadn't told me about it, and he said the report was about a smell, which he'd investigated and found inconclusive. He investigated it by doing nothing, I said. He investigated it by sending me an email, she said. I never received it. I sat with that for a long moment. The apartment was very quiet. The building settled somewhere above us in the way old buildings settle at night, a low creak that I had come to know as the structure doing what structures do when the temperature shifts and the day's tensions release. I had been sitting in my contracted world, maintaining my careful radius, letting the neutral apartment be the container that held what remained of my daily functional capacity. And 3 feet away through the shared wall, a woman had been fighting a landlord alone since July, and sleeping on a sofa for 6 weeks, and photographing her disintegrating bedroom ceiling and writing formal letters with statute numbers she had looked up herself and paying $300 she didn't have for a remediation assessment the building manager had refused to acknowledge. She had been doing all of this 3 feet away. She had been doing it in the adjacent unit. Through the wall I heard her coffee maker and her television, and twice someone crying through, and I had known nothing about any of it, because I had decided, in the first weeks of moving in, that I did not have enough left to know anything about anyone new. I thought about the building manager sending me an email in October that I had also apparently not received, or had received and not registered, or had registered and filed in the place where I was filing things that did not rise to the level of things I had capacity to address. I thought about 4 months of this going on in the unit that shared my wall, invisible to me, while I sat in my kitchen in the evenings looking at the microwave clock and not looking at the photograph. I've been 3 feet away for 7 months, I said. Yes, she said. I know. Why didn't you? I stopped. The question was not a fair one, and I knew it before it finished forming. I had made it abundantly clear through 7 months of minimal eye contact and quick exits from any proximity that I was not available. She had not failed to knock on my door. She had correctly read the situation and responded accordingly, which was more courtesy than I had offered her in return. I didn't know about your report until yesterday, she said. If I had known, the calculation would have been different. A pause. The kind where someone is being precise about what they're saying because they want to be accurate. Although I'm also not certain it would have been. You seemed like you needed the space, and I didn't want to be the person who took it away. Something moved across her face, not relief exactly, more the expression of someone who has been bracing against a wall for a long time, and the wall has moved, just slightly, just enough. Tonight would help, she said. The attorney's meeting is tomorrow morning. I made tea without asking. 2 cups. And put one in front of her, and then I got my laptop and wrote the statement. I described the smell, the first date I had noticed it, the date I had reported it to the building manager, and the 6 weeks of silence that followed. I described the location of my unit relative to hers, the shared wall, the direction of the smell. I included the building manager's name, the date and method of the report, the absence of any meaningful follow-up. It took 12 minutes. I have spent considerably more time on correspondence that mattered considerably less. Petra read the statement twice when I slid the laptop across. She read with the careful attention of someone who has learned, over 4 months of this kind of documentation, that the details matter, and that the other side is counting on the details being wrong. Then she looked up and said, "This is exactly what she needs." While I had been typing, she had been quiet, not managing the silence, sitting in it, the way you sit in something that doesn't require action. I noticed this specifically, and with the particular sharpness of someone who has needed something consistently for 11 months and has been consistently not given it. Grief silences make people uncomfortable. They fill them with small words, small sounds, small offerings of comfort that are actually requests for the person grieving to reassure them that the comfort is landing. Petra filled nothing. She sat with her tea in my neutral kitchen and let the quiet be what it was. And I thought, while I typed, that this was either something she had always been able to do or something she had learned, and that if she had learned it, the learning would have cost her something real. I said, "You should have knocked sooner." She looked at me. "I know," she said. "But you seemed..." She stopped. "Do you want me to say the actual thing?" "Yes," I said. "You seemed like someone in the middle of grief," she said. "Not at the beginning, where people are still in shock and the shock provides a kind of insulation, and not on the other side, where you found some way to carry it. The middle, the part where the shock has worn off and the life you're supposed to be returning to hasn't materialized, and you're doing the daily things, going to work, buying food, existing in the building, but you're doing them at a slight remove from yourself, as if the volume on everything has been turned down to a level you can manage, and you're not sure yet whether it will come back up." She said this precisely, without looking away. I know what that looks like. My father died 4 years ago. For about 8 months after, I was unavailable in every way you've been unavailable. I didn't answer calls I should have answered. I didn't show up to things I'd said I would show up to. I was functioning in the narrow technical sense, and nowhere near functioning in the full sense. And I knew, during that period, that the thing that would have made it worse was if someone knocked on my door and needed something from me. So I didn't knock. She paused. I also didn't know my ceiling was going to turn into an emergency, or I would have made different decisions. The kitchen was very quiet. The clock on the microwave said 11:52. Outside, the building made the sounds old buildings make at midnight, the elevator somewhere, a pipe cooling, the low hum of a city that never quite stops, but gets quieter in a way you only notice when you've been sitting still long enough to hear it. "You seemed like someone in the middle of grief," I said. It was not a question. I was simply confirming that she had named it correctly. "Yes," she said. "I was," I said. "I am, but I'm further along than I was." She looked at me and did not say anything that performed compassion. She simply nodded, once, in the way of someone accepting information rather than managing a response to it. I had moved into this building in December, carrying boxes alone, and she had seen my face coming up the stairs and understood what it contained. And she had made a decision. The decision was this: give him the space the face is asking for. Do not knock. Do not initiate. Say good morning when it happens, and do not manufacture additional occasions for it. Let the elevator be the elevator, and not the beginning of something he is not ready for. She had made this decision from a place of knowledge, not assumption, not indifference, but actual knowledge, earned the same way knowledge of that kind is always earned. Her father. 4 years ago, 8 months of functioning in the narrow technical sense, and nowhere near the full one. She had been doing this deliberately for 7 months, while her ceiling fell apart, while the water source in the shared wall moved from a slow seep to an active structural problem, while the mold grew in the subfloor, while she paid $300 and wrote 3 letters and cited statute sections and slept on a sofa. All of it 3 feet away, through the wall I heard her coffee maker through at 7:15 every morning, and I had known none of it, because I had been so carefully inside my contracted world that what was happening on the other side of the wall had been entirely invisible. She had been the one person in the building not knocking on my door, and she had been the one who most needed me to open it. "Your wife," Petra said, and then she stopped. "I'm sorry." "You don't have to, no," I said. "Go ahead." She held the front door for me once. Before she got sick, I think, or in the early part she didn't seem sick, anyway. But I've since learned that people often don't in the early part, and sometimes not until quite late. We waited for the elevator together, and we talked. She was telling me about trying to make her grandmother's soup recipe, and it kept coming out wrong, and she couldn't figure out why, and I told her it was probably the type of onion, because my grandmother's soup had the same problem, and that turned out to be the answer. Petra said it carefully, with the care of someone carrying something that belongs to someone else and wants to return it without damage. She seemed very pleased. She wrote it down in her phone. She had a laugh that started with her eyes. She stopped. I've thought about that conversation a number of times since December. I didn't know her well, but she made a 10-minute wait for an elevator feel like it was time well spent, and that's not a thing everyone can do. I sat at the kitchen table, and I thought about Claire in the elevator lobby, still herself, still finding the conversation in any available gap of time, carrying her soup problem with her the way she carried everything, openly available, ready to hand it to whoever was standing next to her, getting the answer and going home and making the soup correctly the second time and being quietly pleased about it in the way she was quietly pleased about things she'd fixed, which was a particular pleasure she had and that I had loved in her. The satisfaction of a thing resolved. She had solved the soup problem by talking to the woman in 4B. She had not mentioned it to me by name. She mentioned dozens of small conversations and their results. They were part of the texture of her days, and I had been in the same building, 3 feet away, for 7 months, and had not known this until 11:52 on a Thursday in November. "It was the type of onion," I said, and my voice came out steady, which I had not entirely expected. "It usually is," Petra said, and she said it quietly. And she left it there, and did not try to do anything more with it, which was the right decision. She left at 12:30. She had washed her tea mug before she got up from the table, which I noticed, and she took the statement printed and the attorney's card that I'd asked her to leave so I could call in the morning if the attorney needed to speak to me directly. At the door she stopped and looked at me and said, "Thank you. I'm sorry it took a ceiling falling apart to make this happen. I'm sorry it took this long," I said. "You needed the time," she said. "You're allowed to have needed the time." She said it without judgment or performance, simply as the true thing it was, returned to me as something I hadn't known I was still not entirely sure of. I want to tell you how it resolved. Because the shape of a thing matters, and leaving the shape incomplete feels like a failure of the telling. The attorney meeting happened the following morning. She had told Petra the night before, when Petra texted to say the corroborating statement existed, that this changed the landscape substantially. Presented with my statement, the remediation report, 3 formal letters, the relevant statute sections, and an attorney who had done this before and knew exactly which parts of the building manager's position were defensible and which were not. The building manager authorized the remediation work within 48 hours, He did not, notably, authorize reimbursement for the $300 Petra had paid for the initial assessment. The attorney told Petra she could pursue that separately. Petra said she would, and then said she probably wouldn't. Because the remediation was what mattered, and the $300 was a cost she would accept as the price of the documentation that had eventually, through a long and indirect route, produced the result. The work took 11 days. Specialists, subfloor replacement, the section of shared wall that had been holding the water source. I heard the work through the wall each day and thought, each time, about the 7 months I had been hearing that wall in the other direction and had known nothing of what it contained. Petra moved back into her apartment on a Friday in late November and sent me a text that said, "The bedroom smells like paint and drywall, and this is, relative to what it smelled like before, an almost indescribable improvement." I texted back, "Glad you're home." She texted back, "Me too." She texted. I had given her my number the morning after the attorney meeting. I had thought about it briefly, and then done it, which is how I have learned to make decisions that matter. Think briefly, then act before the thinking becomes a reason not to. It was the first time in 11 months I had given my number to someone new. We have had dinner twice since then. I want to be clear about what I mean when I say dinner. I mean dinner the way neighbors have dinner when they have come through something together that required honesty and mutual good faith, when they have discovered, on the other side of it, that the other person is someone worth knowing, and when that discovery makes the ordinary thing of sharing a meal feel like the natural next step, rather than a gesture that needs explaining. She brings her laptop sometimes and works. I make tea. We talk in the way of two people who have already been through the difficult part of getting to know someone, which is the part where you don't know each other yet, but have to be honest anyway, and who have therefore arrived at the easier part already equipped with more than the usual starting information. We have had the Claire conversation, properly and with time for it, on a Sunday afternoon 2 weeks ago. She told me more about the elevator lobby in October. I told her that the soup had worked the second time, and that Claire had brought a container of it to her mother's house in November, the last Thanksgiving, and had been very pleased about the onion. Petra said she was glad the soup got fixed, even if it was only the one time. I told her it was fixed twice. Claire had made it again the following week for the two of us, at home, because she liked to consolidate a success before it became a one-time thing, and we'd had it on a Wednesday night with bread and the particular satisfaction of something solved. Petra was quiet for a moment after I said that. Then she said, "That sounds like her." From what I could tell, it was exactly her, I said. We sat with that for a moment, and the Sunday afternoon quiet, in the specific and companionable silence that I have realized she knows how to hold, and that I have come, in the past months, to trust. I don't know what Petra and I are building, or whether building is the right word for something that started with 3 quiet knocks on a door at 11:14 and a landlord who had been refusing to authorize remediation work for 4 months. I know that I opened the door. I know that I made tea without asking and wrote the statement the same night and gave her my number the following morning. I know that the contracted world I had been maintaining with such careful intention has, in the months since November, expanded by exactly one person, and that one person has turned out, so far, to be the right size of expansion for where I am. Not too much. Not a demand. Just one person, 3 feet away, who had been giving me exactly the space I needed for 7 months while her ceiling fell apart, who finally knocked quietly at 11:14 and said she didn't know who else to ask. I know that Claire would have found a way to talk to her long before I did. She would have known about the soup and the ceiling and the attorney and probably the name of the remediation company by the end of October. She would have brought something to the door, not to intrude. she was not an intruder, but because she had an instinct for when someone was managing something alone that could be managed better with another person's awareness of it, and she acted on that instinct as a matter of course, without requiring the other person to ask. It was one of the many things I had loved in her and had not fully understood as its own particular skill until I found myself unable to replicate it. She had solved the soup problem in an elevator lobby in October by being herself in the way she was always herself. Available, interested, genuinely present with whoever was next to her. She had gone home and made the soup correctly and brought it to her mother's house in November and been quietly pleased about the onion. She had not, as far as I know, mentioned to the woman in 4B that the advice had worked, because by November she was further into the illness and there were other things to attend to. But she had known the answer, and the woman who had given it to her had thought about the conversation a number of times since December, and I was sitting at my kitchen table at 11:52 on a Thursday, learning all of this as if I were being handed something I had always been meant to receive, but that had taken longer to arrive than anyone had planned. I am moving through this more slowly than Claire would have. More slowly than I was before December. The radius is still smaller than it was, though it has expanded, specifically and precisely by one person. That seems, for now, like the right size of expansion for where I am. Not too much. Not a demand on what I have left. Just one person, 3 feet away, who knew what she was looking at when she saw my face in December and chose accordingly, and who knocked, finally, when the ceiling made it necessary, at 11:14 on a Thursday, 3 times, quietly, the way you knock when you're not entirely sure you should be knocking at all. Have you ever realized that while you were protecting yourself from more loss, someone right next to you was quietly carrying something you could have helped with, and that they'd been keeping their distance not because they didn't see you, but precisely because they did? And have you ever been the one who gave someone the space they needed, not because you didn't care, but because you understood, from your own experience, exactly what it cost to be reached for before you were ready